Hi everyone, welcome to a small walkthrough tutorial of working with files inside of Python. This is going to be useful for your first assignment where you are going to be downloading files and trying to open them and making sure that they work properly. Now, to get started, inside of your week one program files, you have these two txt files. One's called file1 and one is called file2, and they both contain bits of information that you can just read through. You can also add more txt or text inside of here if you'd like. And one more thing is that if you want to experiment during after this lecture, you can go to right-click New, and then you could say something like text document, and that will allow you to create a new text file that you can add stuff into. Great. So what we want to work with next is I have this empty file right now. It will be completed when you download this project, but it's called, it's the wrong one. It should be called working with files.py. And once you have this one created here, I'm going to try to create a function right now. So def open file. And what I'm going to do is try to open a file, and I'm going to give it a file name. So again, there's a few different ways that you can work with files. For the time being, before we work with this function, I'm just going to create a basic file modification for it. So I will keep this guy over here for the time being. What I want to do is I want to say to open a file in Python, you're going to use this function called open. Now, open with, if you don't provide it a path, so essentially if you don't provide it what's up here at the very top, it will automatically set it to be wherever the programs are. So essentially, if I don't provide it a path, it's going to assume that the file is inside the same directory of where the py file is. So make sure you're working in the same directory. And what I can do now is I can provide a string called file1.txt. And you'll notice that file1 doesn't have txt after it, but we do need to provide it, otherwise we won't be able to find it. And the second parameter that I'm going to provide is another string that is called R. So essentially, I'm going to open file1.txt and I'm going to read it. That's what this section of code is saying. Now, what happens if I go ahead and just print out a file? We'll notice that we get this big piece of text that essentially tells us that it's a memory object wrapper and it's encoding in a certain way. If I again remove my txt from this one, you'll notice that I have no such file directory, file1. And directories will come up later when we do recursion. For the time being, though, we'll see that file 1's there. Now, what if I want to access file 2? Well, I can go ahead and just change that to file 2. And you'll notice that it actually gets the name properly for me. Cool. Now, you'll see here that, okay, I opened file 1, but how do I actually access it? What we can usually do is I can create a variable called contents, and I'm going to set it to file.read. And you'll see here that after I set it to file.read and I print the contents, we'll see that we get this large string of all the contents of the file. So again, I'm actually going to comment out this print statement to the file. And what I want to do is print the type of contents. We'll see here that is a class of string. So this is straightforward enough. This is kind of the basics of how you open a file and read it in, but we're most likely going to do a lot more work than that there. So for this example, why don't we try to figure out how we can see how many words occur inside of this file? Well, what we could do here is we can create another variable, probably like a read lines one. And what we could say again is we can reassign contents to be equal to contents.read, or excuse me, contents.split. And what happens when I do a contents.split and I print contents again, we'll see here that when I split my file, it's going to actually set it into a list of items that are all delineated by the space. So one more interesting thing about the split function that's right here is that if you don't provide any parameter, it's going to split a string up based on the amount of spacing in a string. So essentially, this entire thing is split up because of the spaces between it, like so. And one more thing you might notice here is that the comma is actually included inside of this piece of string right here with file. So that might be a little issue. So what we could try to do here is, why don't we actually try to see what happens if instead of providing an empty space, I use a comma. And when I do that, you'll notice that I actually have a list of only 2 items. One of them is the practice test file, and then it is called file1. So what that means for us is essentially that the entire list or the entire txt is split up by two objects, and the comma that's between them tells us where to split up those two pieces of text. So that's essentially what the split does for us. So now if I go ahead and I try to just remove it again by the split, you'll see here I get empty separator. If we get empty separator, you're just going to need to delete that too. One more thing I want to kind of fiddle around with is that what happens if I use colons here? Well, again, if I use colons here, I can actually use the colons as a delimiter between each of these. So again, I get this is a practice test file. It is called file 1. So that's all by itself, but all these guys are split up because they had a colon between them. So again, as a general rule of thumb, whenever you're working with files inside of this class and later on as well, you're going to want to look at what type of delineator you're going to use to split up the file. Usually it will either be a colon, a regular empty space, or a comma. And for ease of simplicity, I'm going to just leave this all as spaces for the time being. See here. Cool. And now what I'm going to try to do is let's try to work with this contents.split here. So again, I have the dot split working for me. See here. Nice. And we get a list. So we'll notice here that the contents type is actually a list, right? We'll see that each of these are a list object. What can we do with that list? Well, we can probably do a for loop through it. So I can say for word in contents, print word. Now we'll see here that we get this is a practice test file. It is called file 1. Cool. So now what we could say here is let's try to make this a bit more complicated. Let's try to just read through and see if we can only find a certain word. So for the time being, what would happen if I only print out I see the word is twice. So I'm going to try to only print out the word is when I'm iterating through this list. So what I could say here inside of my for loop is say if word is equal to the string of is, print word. And it's awesome. Now we get two is printed out. Let's go ahead and try to create another file called file tree. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to kind of spam the word is inside of it. See how many times we can get it printed out. Let me also copy the space. Cool. And now if I change this to be file tree.txt, we'll see I get a bunch of is printed out. So easy enough. That's kind of the basics of how you can open a file and iterate through it. And now what I want to look at is how do we actually write to the file. So to kind of get a bit complicated with this, what I want to do is I want to open a file and based on a parameter of n, or like the word length, I want to save the word that is of a certain length into a file and write it over. So essentially, I want to take every word that is above the length of tree or above, so tree characters or more, and write it into a new txt file from file 1. And how we can actually do that here is let's actually make this a function itself. I'm going to say write the file with count. I'm not the best with the names, so we'll just say it like that. What I'm going to say is I want to take in a parameter called file name, which is the file name I'm going to open, and then I'm going to take in a parameter called n, which is going to be the length of the words that I'm looking for. So to go ahead and get started, what I could say here is file is equal to open, and let me go ahead and actually comment this out for the time being. And because I have a parameter called file name, which will be essentially file1.txt in this scenario, I'm going to open that file name. And what am I going to do to it? I'm going to write to that file name. So what I want to do now is I'm also going to list, and this is where writing comes into play. If you're ever writing with a file, you're going to want to keep the contents of whatever you're writing, most likely into a list. And very soon we'll see why we need to keep it into a list. So what I'm going to say here is words to write, maybe something like an empty list like here. And what I'll do now is I'm going to say contents is equal to file.read. And then I'm also going to say contents is equal to contents.split. And because we already know that the file is split up by spaces, this is fine. Again, what happens if there was a comma inside of our txt? We'd need to put a comma right there, right? That's going to tell us what to split it as. Cool. So now what I'm going to do is what I'll try to do here is I'm going to say for word in contents. And then what I'll say here is if length of word is greater than or equal to n, what I'll do here is I'm going to just append into my list of words to write the word that I found that is greater than or equal to n. And now, because our function isn't going to write just yet, I'm going to return the words to write. And what I'll do, I'm actually going to make this variable name a bit easier. I'm going to just call it write file. And this write file, what I'm going to take in is I'm going to provide it a file name of file1.txt and a parameter of tree. And we'll see here, I'm actually going to, I'm going to save this return value is going to be saved into a variable called list. And let me print out this list. Again, whenever we return something, we can actually do something like this where we say, okay, variable name is equal to write file. We'll see here now that I'm getting not every single word that's in there, but I'm removing the is a, it is, and I'm keeping all the bigger words. So that's pretty good. We actually got the file to pick out what we wanted, but how do we actually write these items into a file? The way that we could do that is by, again, doing an opening method. So we can say file is equal to open, and this is where it can get a little tricky. You don't actually need to open a file that exists already. So what I can say is I want to open a file called test.txt, and I want to not read from it, but I want to write to it. And if I actually run this snippet of code right here, you might have noticed on the side over here that I got this new variable, or excuse me, a new txt called text right away. So whenever you're writing with this W prompt and you provide a file name that doesn't exist, it will actually open it for you. Now, do I need to delete this every time? No, you don't need to. What you can do essentially is rerun it and it will just replace it essentially. So whenever you do something like this with W, that will open it. Cool. Now, how do you actually write to a file here? Well, because the file object is open, I can actually just go ahead and say file.write, and I'm going to write something like hello world. All right, everyone. Sorry for the short snippet there. So let's just say that I planned that one out there. You may have noticed that when we were working with these files that I didn't close the file, and I was actually getting some undefined behavior going on because of it. So I'm going to add a bit more to my write here. And if I run my code, we'll notice that I'm getting a weird error with my tests where my text isn't popping up. So whenever we're opening a file to write to it, it's very important to make sure that you close it as well. So now when I close this guy, we'll see that it's working just as we expected with the file.write. Now, one thing I wanted to showcase here, so always use the files.close, and you can do it after you open the file and read it in. I would say just close it. So up here, when I do files equal to open, and I finally split it, I would do something like files.close like that. Now, what happens if I try to write a Boolean called true? We'll notice, excuse me, that whenever we write to a file, we get the argument must be string, not bool. And we're thinking, okay, that's a bit odd. What if I write the number 505 to it? It's the same issue. So whenever you're writing to a txt file using this logic of file.write, it has to be a string. Now, why is that an issue? Well, sometimes you might be working with things that aren't strings, and how do we solve it? In our for loop, we are most likely going to need to convert them over to a string. So to go ahead and try to do this here, for our purposes of file one, we don't need to, but I'll showcase it's going to be a bit redundant looking, but the logic is that we need to use a string. I'll just call this hello again. So what I'm going to do here is let's go back up to my write file function, and we'll see here that I got all the words appended into what I want to say. And so what I can do now here is I could say file is equal to open. And what I want to open, I'm going to call this new file.txt, and I'm going to write to it. And inside of my for loop, so I'm going to say for word in words to write. What I'm going to say here is file.write word. Now, let's just say that we have a list of numerical values instead of strings that we need to work with. What will we need to do inside of here? We would need to convert the word that we're writing into a string for us. Now, after I go ahead and I iterate over all of those, I'm going to do a file.close. I probably don't need a return value anymore. And what I'm going to do now is let's go ahead get rid of these guys, and I'm going to say, okay, write file.txt. And if I run my code here, we'll see that I get a new file. And look, it looks like I'm getting every single string put over for me. Now we'll notice that this doesn't look that good. There's no spacing. So how do we fix this? Inside of my write method, what I can do is actually add a bit of spacing manually like this. And now when I rerun my code again, we'll see I get spacing. What happens if you wanted to write over a file to have each word on its own individual line? What you would do then is use /n, and the /n essentially would be a keyword that goes ahead and puts them on individual lines. Cool. So that's essentially the file.write to get it over, and there's some logic here where we work with these n. And this is a really neat way of doing it, because we'll see here that I can actually go ahead and change the file that I'm writing over to it. So file tree only has is like so. And if I go ahead and say file tree like so, and I go to new file, you'll notice that it's empty because the list gave us it back to be empty. What happens if I use a 2 because I have all these is's? In my new file, we'll see that I get each is that was from there. So again, this is a brief introduction or reintroduction to our file writing. There's always a few things that you can manipulate a bit. Contents.split is one way you could do it. You can also use read lines instead of read. So please look into that too. But this should suffice for your first assignment.